This is the M4 iPad Pro, and after 10 days of using it, there's a lot that I love about this device, and still a lot to be desired. Don't get me wrong, the new iPad Pro comes with a host of great new features, including the tandem OLED display, accessories, and the M4 chip, but when it comes to truly taking advantage of all of that great hardware, things aren't quite there in my opinion. That being said, you can still get a surprising amount done on the new iPad Pro, and today I want to get into what you can actually get out of it, if it can replace a MacBook at this point for some people, and just some general good and bad things that I've come across with this device. So if you'd like to know more about the newest Pro iPad from Apple, stick around and let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. It seems like for the last few years, whenever there's a new iPad that comes out, the conversation always seems to turn to, what is this product supposed to be? One of the iPad's biggest strengths and weaknesses is its versatility. You can use it for watching content, playing games, productivity, and even get into some creative workflows like photo and video editing, but it doesn't necessarily do all those things the way that you'd expect. iPadOS feels like a completely different world to macOS at times. Sure, there's a lot of similarities and things that transfer across platforms, but the iPad is fundamentally a lot different device, and I think the first step in figuring out if this particular model is going to work for you and what exactly you can get out of it is by looking at the device itself. Design-wise, the M4 iPad Pro is remarkably small. The model that I have here is the 11-inch variant, and it's 5.3 millimeters thick. Just to give you an idea of what that means comparatively, a pane of glass in a shower door or a tabletop is often thicker than this, so it's truly not that far off from actually holding a pane of glass, which is kind of wild to think about. I know it's not all that different from the M2 version that was only 0.6 millimeters thicker, but for whatever reason, it makes it feel quite different to me. And the 13-inch version has even more disparity and is even thinner than the 11-inch, so I can't even imagine how that feels. Even with it being that thin, it feels surprisingly durable. You've got the same anodized aluminum finish as on the previous models. This one is space gray with the same squared edged look, button placement, speaker grills, and USB-C port. That, combined with a weight of only 444 grams, makes this extremely portable and easy to use casually around the house or if you're traveling, and really lends itself to a lot of casual use cases like web browsing or watching content. Part of what makes this so great for watching content is both the display and the sound. The 2024 iPad Pro comes with a new tandem OLED display, meaning that there's two OLED screens stacked on top of each other, and that gives it more brightness and dynamic range. That has a full screen max brightness of 1000 nits or 1600 nits max in HDR, which is outstanding for an OLED. I mentioned this in last week's video when talking about the Air versus the Pro, but this looks better than just about any other OLED panel that I've personally seen. The model that I have here is the glossy finish, but if you get the 1 or 2 terabyte variants, you can spend an extra $100 to get the nano texture version, say if you're working in bright areas a lot, but for me, I'm fine with the regular anti-glare coating for reflections, and I think the glossy finish just really shows off how great this display is. You get those deep, inky blacks with outstanding depth and color. The display does have P3 wide color that's also quite accurate, so things like photo and video editing are going to be pretty reliable, and that really lends itself to consuming media as well. This is a ProMotion variable refresh rate display that goes anywhere between 10 and 120 Hz. It's not only great for scrolling around the interface, but it will actually drop down to 24 Hz in some cases to match 24 frame per second content. That gives you a bit better picture. That tandem OLED is likely going to be more efficient as well, as having two panels means that each one can run at reduced power. And that combined with whatever algorithmic devil magic Apple uses to prevent burn-in is supposed to substantially reduce any kind of wear or burn-in that you'd traditionally see on an OLED panel. One other thing that I wanted to mention is I've got some really light scratching along the surface of the display that I literally just noticed, and I'm kind of bummed about. I have no idea how it got there. I've been super careful with this, so it's likely either from the Magic Keyboard or the Apple Pencil, but judging from the way that the scratches are, I kind of think that maybe something got on the tip of the Apple Pencil or something and maybe scratched it just a little bit, but it's just something to be aware of. You might want to grab a screen protector for one of these if you pick one up, but it does kind of take away the experience from the Apple Pencil. Like I said, the other half of enjoying media on the iPad Pro is the sound, which is kind of mind-blowing on this device given how tiny it is. You've got a 4-speaker sound system that pushes out a surprising amount of depth and clarity, much like the previous generation did. That sounds great whether you're listening to music or watching content, or regardless of which orientation you have the iPad in. Speaking of orientation, the front-facing camera has now changed from being portrait-oriented to now being centered in landscape mode, which makes this much less awkward for taking video or FaceTime calls. Almost all the cases and keyboards that work with the iPad have them propped up in a landscape view anyway, so this is just a much more natural position. The camera itself is pretty much the same as the M2 iPad Pro, as is the 4-mic array and the main rear camera. I did give a sample of that front-facing camera and the mics in last week's video, so if you want to check that out, I will link it in the description, but the one difference with this camera system is you now have a LiDAR scanner in place of the ultra-wide lens, which I'm all for. I've already had a lot more fun playing around with that than I ever have with the actual rear cameras, which I almost never use. And another new introduction with this camera system is the adaptive flash that works with the rear camera to take a quick burst of photos and stitch them all together when you're scanning something. So you can get a super clean scan of a document without any shadows, which I think is a great use case for the iPad, at least better than taking photos or videos with it. I would say those kinds of things and media consumption on the go are some of the better use cases for this device, and while the display with the landscape-centered camera are some of the biggest differentiators of this year's version, you're likely going to want to do a lot more with your iPad, and I would say that's where things get kind of interesting. Inside here, there's a brand new M4 chip that's not currently in any other Apple product. That's based on a 3nm process, which means the components within this chip are much smaller than the last generation iPad Pro that was on a 5nm process. The model that I have here is the 256GB base option, meaning that it has a 9-core CPU and 10-core GPU with 8GB of RAM, and it does beat my M3 MacBook Air in benchmarks with about a 14 to 20% increase in performance on the CPU, and about 14 to 17% in GPU performance, which is pretty crazy, but the chances that you're going to effectively notice or be able to use all that power is questionable. This is where iPadOS comes into play and where I think it can end up restricting what you can do with the iPad. The file system, while it has gotten a lot better over the last couple of years, still feels a bit clunky. I'm not really a fan of how it treats the Photos library as kind of a separate entity from the actual Files app, and I found dealing with external storage to be a huge pain as well, which I will get into in a few minutes, but it's just really evident that this is still very much rooted in iOS. There's still no way to effectively code on this machine without any workarounds, which is something that I've personally wanted on the iPad for years. And while you can edit videos on the M4 iPad Pro, it just leaves a lot to be desired. Final Cut Pro for iPad feels more like a light version of the Mac app, where you can't even do things like add LUTs. I know there are some updates coming for that app, but it still feels kind of bare bones, and frankly, I haven't been too thrilled about the desktop version lately either. DaVinci Resolve definitely has the most parity with a desktop experience, and I know a lot of folks like using LumaFusion on the iPad, so there is definitely a place for this kind of thing, but in a general sense, I do think that those use cases on an iPad are, again, better for someone who doesn't require feature-rich editing software. Now, if you're using an iPad for productivity, I do think that there is a huge benefit at times because the apps are a lot more focused and intentional than macOS, where you can clutter up a desktop with a bunch of windows and the dock, so some people might enjoy that interface a little bit more, but you really don't need an M4 for that kind of thing, and even some Office apps are going to be quite different than their desktop counterparts, so it's really all about what experience you prefer. One area where you will potentially notice gains in performance is likely going to be gaming, where as more demanding games come out for the iPad, you'll be able to take advantage of the hardware-accelerated ray tracing that's built into the M4. I've tried a couple of games that are semi-resource intensive like Resident Evil 4, and where the M2 iPad Pro would struggle a little bit at 60 frames per second, this is buttery smooth, so if you are a gamer, that might be of interest to you. The majority of other tasks I'd say aren't going to be a whole lot different on the M4 versus the options below it. Photo editing feels pretty much the same in Lightroom as on the M2 iPads. Although I have to say I much prefer photo editing on the iPad with a pencil than without. And the pencil itself is something that I'm really enjoying on both the new iPad Pro and the Air. Both those iPads use the all-new Apple Pencil Pro, and if you're someone who likes taking a lot of notes, or you're just reaching for the Apple Pencil quite a bit, this feels almost exactly the same in your hand as the regular Apple Pencil, but has some great new features. You can now pinch the barrel to bring up a tool palette in different apps, which is super handy for easily changing tips or brushes. You can also rotate the barrel to get a different angle on your brush, which will work in a variety of apps, and there's a new haptic engine located in the pencil. So anytime you pinch the barrel, or even when performing some actions within different apps, you get a nice tactile click. I end up taking a lot of notes when I'm just brainstorming ideas, and I prefer to actually jot those down versus using a keyboard and mouse. And this is great for that, or if you're an artist. You've still got the same pressure sensitivity and tilt functionality, and apps like Procreate are going to be heavily leaning into these new pencil features. So for someone who specifically uses the Apple Pencil a lot, especially with artwork, there's likely some things that you're really going to enjoy. The Magic Keyboard is another accessory that was updated. This new version is only available on the M4 iPad Pro, and although it is quite expensive, coming in at $299 for the 11-inch version, the quality is fantastic. It's got an aluminum base, and it's not a whole lot different than the previous version, but you do have a working function row now, and a new trackpad that supports multi-touch with its own haptic feedback, which I've really enjoyed so far. It definitely feels similar to typing on a MacBook. Again, if you're spending a lot of time in Office apps on the go, especially if they're web-based like Google Docs or Sheets, the iPad paired with this Magic Keyboard could potentially be used in place of a MacBook in that sense. The Magic Keyboard still has a pass-through USB-C port for charging, so you can charge this while also using the USB-C port on the iPad for something else. So it is nice that it frees up that port, but just speaking to USB-C, that's been somewhat of an issue for me. Now, I think this is probably just an iPadOS bug, but when I would go to test my external SSD drives with the iPad Pro, I had a lot of issues with both the drives being recognized after disconnecting and reconnecting them, and after reconnecting, they'd often push out USB 2 speeds. Restarting the iPad seemed to resolve the issue, but there wasn't any difference whether I had it plugged in through a Thunderbolt hub or just directly into the iPad, so hopefully that gets resolved with a software update at some point. You do still have the same Thunderbolt 4 speeds as the previous version had, although the drive speeds aren't quite as fast in iPadOS as they are in macOS. But that higher bandwidth port is kind of a must if you want to effectively run this as a desktop and run things like external storage. The iPad Pro can power an external display up to 6K, and it does run the studio display just fine, but for me, it just feels kind of clunky in here. Moving things around is a pain, and if I have the app switcher open on the iPad, I can't type on my external display for some reason. And it's missing some nice, handy settings like switching audio devices, amongst other things, and I just can't see myself using this until the experience gets a lot better. You've also got that one lone USB-C port, so to effectively use this with external accessories, you will need to use a hub of some kind, and each time you add something on there, you are watering down the performance on that port. And if you don't have power delivery through a monitor or something like the Magic Keyboard, you're going to have to find a solution there because the battery will drain much faster in a setup like that. On this iPad alone, you do get about the same battery life as the last generation. Despite this M4 iPad being thinner than the last generation, the battery is actually bigger, so you have just over 31 watt-hours where the M2 iPad was just over 28, which is impressive given the size difference. I can get through what would be a full 8-hour workday on this battery without any issue. I normally have about 20 to 25% left after 8 hours of use. So things are pretty good on that front, and the standby time is excellent, so no complaints there. And really, it's not like I have a ton of complaints with this device in general, if I'm being completely honest. Like, I'm not overly disappointed with anything here, I just don't exactly know how to get the most out of the M4 iPad Pro at this stage. This is extremely powerful, but outside of things like the form factor and the new display, in terms of just moving around and doing things on the iPad, I don't know that it's gonna feel all that much different than the M2 iPad Air or the M2 iPad Pro for that matter. Right now, it just feels like more of a casual use device, unless your day more so just revolves around editing Google Docs, answering emails, and that kind of thing. We do have WWDC coming up right around the corner, so maybe in a couple of weeks there will be some new iPad stuff that we can look forward to that will better leverage the M4 with all the power in here. And don't get me wrong, I really appreciate what Apple has done here, regardless of my experience. The display is fantastic, and the fact that they've got this down to just 5mm thick is wild, and it's those kinds of smaller innovations that often lead to much bigger things down the line. I just wish I could do more here. I would love to know if any of you out there that have this iPad or a new-ish model have had a similar experience. Or maybe if you've moved parts of, if not your entire workflow to the iPad, let me know in the comments down below on what that looks like exactly, because I am genuinely curious. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video or you found it useful. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content or help me build a drone that delivers handwritten love letters from imaginary admirers, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.